Hello, I'm Brian Shakin, Senior Economist from the Conference Board, and this is a special webcast, Beyond the Hype, real workforce trends in the gig economy, looking beyond the headlines to see how fast are firms actually adopting workforce arrangements besides full-time work. Some of the main questions that we're going to be covering on this webcast include what are some of the most important trends in non-traditional work? What factors are limiting and encouraging employers to use more non-traditional workers? How are businesses using non-traditional workers to meet their business needs? In what occupations are businesses most likely to use online labor market platforms to find talent? And what approaches are businesses taking in order to attract and engage non-traditional workers? During the course of this webcast, our audience will have an opportunity to earn credits, HRCI, SHRM, CPE. The way to do that is to stay online the entire webcast, click on the three pop-ups as they appear, and most importantly to right now put in the title of and email address of the type of credit that you wish to earn. Joining me today in the studio, first to my right, Amy Abel. She's the Managing Director for Human Capital here at the Conference Board. Amy, welcome.
Thank you, Brian. It's very exciting to be here with you on this project.
Thank you, Amy. And to my further right is Gad Lebanon. He's the Chief Economist North America. You'll be seeing him again tomorrow for Economics Watch webcast, but today he's here to talk to us about non-traditional work. So Gad, welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
And joining us from just outside of Baltimore is Elizabeth Crowfoot. She is the Senior Economist for International Labor Market Comparisons Program and led our efforts to investigate online labor market platforms as part of this exciting project. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So Gad, in order to understand why are firms thinking about using non-traditional workers, I think it's really important to understand what is happening in the labor market today. How are companies starting to think about talent as more or less difficult to obtain? So what are the key factors that may be driving companies to start thinking about using non-traditional workers?
Yeah, well, we happen to be in a time with one of the tightest labor markets we ever had. The retirement of the baby boomers are leading to almost no growth in the working age population. At the same time, hiring has been very strong in recent years, so we are at a point where we have labor shortages in the US economy. That I think has been more documented in recent years. What I think is new and something we figured out as we dug more into the data is that the labor shortages are more visible in blue-collar related occupations than in highly educated white collar. There is actually a report that's going to come out on it 2 days from now on Thursday, but we'll probably have plenty of webcasts on that. But I think the bottom line is that there are significant recruiting difficulties. It's hard to find enough workers, especially in blue-collar and low-paid services jobs. Wages are accelerating more rapidly. And there is a question of what could be done. There are several things that companies can do, but in the context here, when companies are struggling with finding regular workers, the option of non-traditional workers becomes more important.
No, that's absolutely true. And you mentioned, Gad, that wages are starting to accelerate as the unemployment rate decreases. When was it that wages started to pick up at a faster pace than it was before?
Well, it's been we started this expansion in historically low wages, as we can see here. We have the green and the red lines are measures of wage growth. They were both historically low right after the Great Recession. And we've seen some acceleration throughout that period, but especially in the last year or two, especially I would say last year, the acceleration in wages became more visible, to the point that now they're still not back to pre-recession rates, but are getting there.
So I should mention that during the course of this webcast, please ask your questions. You can type them into the question pod, and we love to hear them because they do create a more interactive webcast. Gad, one of the truly striking features of your research is that so often in the last few decades, we've heard about the rising college wage premium. The idea that for workers with college degrees and advanced degrees, their wages are growing at a faster pace than is the case for those workers without college degrees. What have we seen in the last few years? And what are some of the factors that have led to this change that has favored blue-collar and low-wage service workers in terms of wage growth?
Right. So what we see here, I especially focus on the red line here, which is management, professional, and related occupations. Those are 40% of the U.S. workforce, and in terms of labor costs, they are way over 50% because they are the high earners on average. But what you see that if you look at the red line versus the blue and the green line, which are the blue-collar and low-paid services occupations, you see that throughout most of history, or at least this chart goes back to early 2000s, but if we had the chart going further back, it would be the case that the red line is typically above the blue and the green line in recent decades. What we see in the last 2 years or so is that the blue-collar and low-paid services occupations are now experiencing wage growth that far surpasses the wage growth for the highly educated white-collar workers. Now, perhaps there are several reasons for that. One is that the U.S. is becoming a more educated country. A larger and larger share of young people have a BA degree, and people with a BA typically do not want to get a blue-collar or a low-paid services job. So on the one hand, we have fewer people who are willing to take those jobs, and at the same time, the demand for those jobs just keeps on increasing. So in the last decade or so, occupations that were typically automated, like production workers and a lot of other blue-collar and low-paid services, in the last 8 years or so, there has been almost no further automation, and those jobs kept growing pretty rapidly. In terms of drivers, the emergence of online shopping significantly increased the demand for drivers and for warehouse workers. So there has been a pretty rapid growth in those jobs at the same time that the supply of those workers has been shrinking, and that's causing a tightening labor market and faster wage growth.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea that the rate of growth for college-educated workers in the labor force is increasing even as the number of non-college educated workers is declining. What does that say about the future risk of continued increases in blue-collar and low-paid service wage growth? And in addition to that, what kinds of talent shortages should companies expect over the next few years?
Right. Well, I think this chart gives this, it's a little complicated, but it's worth spending some time on, because it's, I think, shows that the worst is not behind us. The worst is not behind us. So what we have here, if you look at the black bars, we have here 5 periods of 5 years, starting in 2002, and we have a projection through 2027. So if we look at the black bars for a second, that's the overall growth rate in each period of the working age population, here defined as 20 to 64. So you see this is slowing down and getting close to zero at the last between 2022 and 2027. So that's one of the reasons why we have in general labor shortages. But if we look divide it into people with a BA and people without a BA, so people with a BA are here in blue, and people without a BA are in red. You see there is a divergence here. So whereas the people with a BA, the blue bars, they're essentially growing more or less at the same rate throughout this period. It's almost, you don't see any serious interruption, growing at about 11% in every 5-year period here. Where you do see a strong trend is in the red bars. That's the growth rate of the number of people without a BA, and that is actually already been shrinking in the last 5 years, and the shrinkage is going to accelerate as we move towards 2027 and beyond. So the problem that we're having now is likely to only get worse as the supply of workers without a BA is declining, and we really need something fundamental to change in the labor market in order to accommodate this change.
So you have some ideas about exactly what those fundamental changes can be. You mentioned earlier the idea of automation, which certainly could apply to some of these blue-collar and low-paid services positions. Why hasn't automation in those occupations picked up in quite the way that you might expect over the last few years? Will that change going forward? And what are some other solutions that companies have at their disposal to manage future labor costs in those occupations?
Yeah, I think automation is a very important part of the answers. If automation continued the way it did before the Great Recession in the last 10 years, we probably wouldn't be having a project about labor shortages for blue-collar workers. The problem is that it significantly declined. Why it declined is a topic of many papers and the conferences right now in the economics profession. There is not one single answer. The more pessimists are saying that simply the underlying trend of replacing workers with technology has significantly slowed down, that a lot of the low-hanging fruit already took place 10, 20 years ago, and to automate the next job is becoming harder. The more optimists are saying that the slow productivity growth or slow automation in the last 8 years or so was a result of mostly weak labor markets during that period. So when you have a lot of available workers willing to work for low pay and profits are high, then you don't have as much incentive to reorganize your company and exploit more technology opportunities. But as we now move into a tighter labor market with higher labor costs, the incentive is going to be there. And it's still hard to tell, but we may be seeing some green shoots of accelerating productivity. We had some green shoots in the past that stayed shoots, but we now with a tight labor market, we may see some actual growth in automation. But the second biggest way to deal with it is there are a lot of people who are still sitting on the sidelines of the labor market. Getting them in is something that could help. We are seeing already labor market conditions for people without a high school degree are now the best since we started recording that a few decades ago, and companies realize that they can't get the same educational requirements that they asked in the past, and they are lowering them. We see, for example, with women in transportation, which is not a profession or a group of occupations that women typically go into, we see a huge increase in the share of women in transportation jobs in recent years. More minorities also in some occupations delaying retirement and hiring more older workers. Those are ways to expand the labor force. with a given very slow growth in working age population. There are also variation across locations. Some locations have more availability of workers, and shifting operations to areas that have more workers is also an option. Sometimes those areas are outside the United States. But in many cases, there is no, I know employers don't like to do that, but eventually they have to raise compensation, which is something we've seen more visibly in 2018.
And it may be, Gad, if I could jump in, it's just because what you're saying is that we don't need as many college-educated people right now. The demand obviously is in blue-collar worker, and maybe companies can just recruit younger folks that haven't maybe even had a chance to complete their college education. Not at the expense of the education, but that they could perhaps hire them even earlier than what they normally might have, to place them in roles as a development opportunity, for the future, to complete those roles that they actually need to fill.
Yeah, there was an article in the New York Times today or yesterday where an expert in the area said that already in high school we devote all our attention of getting people into a four-year college, and for many of them that's not the right move, and we should also consider investing in other educational options that don't end up in a four-year college but are very important in the current labor market.
Well, we used to have that in this country.
Yeah.
They learned trade, they learned skills, and they learned all sorts of wood, metal working, all those things that we probably don't have enough of today.
Yeah.
But Amy, isn't there a substantial risk that when you think about vocational education, which in this current labor market seems like a panacea, that automation does pick up and the skills that are required for the future labor force are very different from some of the skills that are being most rewarded in the current labor market environment?
It's true. I'm not the expert on which best vocational skills we should highlight, but and surely there have been changes in the skills that are more in demand than others, but the lack of focus on vocational education, period, I think has completely fizzled in this country, which could have been an attributing factor to the current status. And the example that I can think of what you're asking is drivers, like truck drivers, delivery drivers, right? Apparently, you can't find enough truck drivers out there, and they get paid very, very high sums of money, but nobody wants to do it because we're now investing all into driverless vehicles. So even if you want to be a truck driver right now, you're going to be potentially obsolete in a very near future. So, what's a company to do? You're not yet there yet on the driverless, but you can't recruit them because nobody wants to be a truck driver knowing they'll be obsolete in a few years.
So what's a company to do is a very nice transition into our report, the non-traditional worker, real economic trends and the impact on your workforce. How exactly can you think about, as another solution, using non-traditional work arrangements in order to meet some of these talent gaps, and how frequently are companies using gig economy type arrangements that we do hear so much media coverage about? So Gad, what are non-traditional work arrangements?
So, there are a lot of names for it. Probably our audience heard contingent workers, gig workers. There are many names for this. In this report, we decided to call them non-traditional, but even that requires further explanation. So when we talk specifically about four groups of workers, one is independent contractors, the others are workers in temporary help or staffing companies, workers that are on-premise but they are employed by outsourcing companies, and the fourth group, which is actually kind of a subgroups of the first group, is workers that are employed through labor market platforms. So those are kind of independent contractors that work through a platform and get paid through that platforms. Places like Upwork is a good example, but perhaps the biggest example is Uber and Lyft that started a lot of the emergence of the gig economy was the success of those platforms in the transportation sector.
And I think it's important to mention when you talk about platforms like Uber and Upwork, we're pointing out that and there is a question on the line that refers to this, just as automation can refer to both blue collar and white collar work, that's also true of non-traditional work arrangements in labor market platforms. I know our focus so far has been on blue collar and low paid service jobs, but these solutions can apply in equal measure to more highly paid occupations as well.
Yeah, so for example, the computer-related or IT-related occupations are programmers and such. They are one of the more visible groups of non-traditional workers.
So when we looked at data around non-traditional workers, what did we find in terms of recent trends about how frequently they're being used and whether or not their use is growing in business right now or not?
Yeah. So, this is one of the most undermeasured part of the US economy, and we didn't really know much about it because the last time the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a survey on they call it the contingent or alternative work arrangements, was 2005. So we were kind of navigating in the dark. There were a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I think the rise of Uber that created a lot of discussion and expectation that this will be a growing share of the economy. But what we discovered is that there was actually not much growth in that. And in particular, the BLS came with a new contingent worker survey in 2017, 12 years after it did in 2005. And what we have in this chart is we have 4 groups here of workers: independent contractors, on-call workers, temporary help agency workers, and workers provided by contract firms. And you see, during the 22 years that this survey was conducted, there hasn't been any dramatic changes, certainly from 2005 to 2017. If anything, the results suggest that there was a slight decline in the share of non-traditional workers. So that and some other data on self-employment, people who pay taxes as self-employment that do not hire other workers, all kinds of other proxies for non-traditional workers have also been weak to grow. So our conclusion is that the growth in this sector of the economy has been very small, if existing at all.
And indeed, while changes in technology that Elizabeth will speak in much more detail about later in our webcast have changed possibilities for the use of non-traditional workers, what we haven't seen is changes in US labor market policy that would result in more use of these non-traditional work arrangements. And this chart illustrates the fact that in the US, there are many fewer workers on temporary contracts than there are in most European economies. And there are 2 reasons for this. Number one, the US labor market is considerably more flexible. It's much easier to dismiss workers and adjust the size of a company's workforce to its needs. And so as a result, there's less of an incentive not to hire workers full time. But the second reason is that workers are relying on employer-provided benefits in healthcare, in 401k programs. And as a result of that, it's much more risky for workers to go off on their own and risk having access to those benefits. And one key change that could possibly in the coming years result in more non-traditional work is the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. having an improved individual health insurance market means that, and also having subsidies for lower income workers in order to obtain health care outside of employer provided health insurance, lowers the risk of workers not being able to obtain health care outside of traditional employment relationships. In addition, there are some incentives in the legislation for smaller employers not to provide health insurance coverage to their employers. So that may also increase the number of workers on individual health insurance plan. But there's concerns about the future of the legislation, whether or not it will remain intact, how vigorously it's going to be enforced. And there's also the matter of other types of benefits like savings programs. And there have been proposals around creating an independent worker classification, which would serve as a way for workers who are working for multiple employers at one time, like many non-traditional workers, like many independent contractors, to then be able to obtain pieces of benefit programs from these different employers. But I think one key element that could determine how quickly non-traditional work is adopted over the next 5 to 10 years is the emergence of online labor market platforms. So Elizabeth, could you tell us a bit about the types of online labor market platforms that employers have at their disposal and the types of occupations that they can hire through those platforms?
Sure. First of all, I definitely want to clarify, what is it that we mean by online labor platforms? And essentially, they are online intermediaries that enable workers to sell a service or a good online. And there are two types of platforms. One is a capital platform where participants can sell goods or rent assets. So this is renting a room in your house on Airbnb or selling goods on eBay. And then the labor platforms are connecting employers and workers, and those workers are performing specific projects or tasks. And under that type of platform, there are two other subcategories. One is the physical on-demand services platform, and those mediate local services. And this is the Uber and the Lyft and other transportation type services, as well as TaskRabbit, for example, where you can get someone to come to your home and clean, or to mount a TV on your wall, other type of on-site services. And then the online on-demand services platforms are where work and payment are delivered completely digitally. So this is really geared toward knowledge workers, white-collar workers, whereas the physical platforms are really geared to those blue-collar occupations. But these online platforms, such as freelancer.com or Upwork, those are those software developers, the graphic designers, that can be done, that type of work can be done anywhere. So that leads me into really talking about two main takeaways from this topology. And the first relates to the physical platforms. They really aren't just for domestic households anymore. Increasingly, they're being geared toward commercial services and also offering online staffing solutions, so where you could hire hourly workers to fill in shifts in your business. So it's providing a lot of opportunities for businesses to also use these platforms. And then the second point that I'd like to make is on the virtual platforms, they're really catering to those jobs that can be done completely online from anywhere in the world. So there are workers that are participating on these platforms from in India, in Asia, really all over the world. So it creates opportunities for businesses to use them as an additional outsourcing mechanism. So that's sort of the background on what the platform economy is and some of the potential that businesses can use, how they can use them.
So as Elizabeth illustrates well, companies have many, many options in terms of what types of platforms they can use. So that begs the question, has your company used online labor market platforms to hire workers? And our options for our poll question, which you can now participate in, are not at all, experimentally, on a limited basis, or frequently. So we'll provide a few seconds to respond to that poll question. See how frequently firms are using this plethora of platform options.
I think
Okay,
people are still voting, but maybe they stop now.
Okay, let's close the poll. So the vast majority of members on this call report that their company has not used labor market platforms at all. Does that result surprise any of you?
Well, I'm not surprised, because I've been talking about this topic with our members for the last several months, and so many of them didn't make any attempt to use them. So I'm not surprised.
And just to build on that, I think the companies that I've been talking to also struggle with these online platforms. Not that they're not intrigued by the concept, but most companies have to deal with their HRIS systems and their payroll systems and all these other different systems, and all you have for them is a confusion of all these other systems, and do they connect, and of course they don't, and how do we connect, and it creates a lot of tension for them to basically operate the way they need to amongst the different workforce people that they have.
Elizabeth, you've talked a lot about, and we'll go back to the slides now, you've talked a lot about how the lack of compatibility of some of these shared service platforms may be holding back companies from using non-traditional work arrangements. Another aspect is the characteristics of specific jobs, some of which are more amenable to platforms, some of which are less amenable. What are some of those jobs that are more or less amenable to the use of online platforms, and where maybe our firms could get started in their use of online labor market platforms?
Sort of building in on what we were saying about the poll results and not a lot of people experiment or using them yet. And, that's exactly what our research found. It's a lot of hype around using these platforms and, what's going on domestically versus in business. And what we see in this particular slide is the percent of households that are participating in the online platform economy. And it's segmented out in those different types of platforms. So we've got platform or capital platforms, and also the labor platforms that are represented here in this chart. And the labor platforms are the orange line. So that's where I want to draw your attention. And the dark orange line are the transportation platforms, so Uber, Lyft, and all those delivery services. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the growth in the platform economy, is in that transportation sector. Whereas in the bottom of the chart, you see a light yellow or light orange line. That is every other type of platform work, not in transportation. So it's the software developers and the graphic designers that I mentioned previously, and all other types of occupations that are not related to transportation that had been stagnating for the last 5 years or so. So what we're seeing is that the entire sector is really being driven by transportation, and as we reach a saturation point with transportation occupations in the platform economy, we're going to expect that growth to diminish even further. But as to the specific occupations, let me move on to that slide. I'm going to skip over this one for now. I may come back to it if I have time. But part of our report, what we did is that we classified many different types of occupations on a specific online platform into specific occupations. So we mapped them to see what is it that what kind of jobs are we finding on these platforms. And we also organize them by skill level and by the type of platform that you can find them on. And this here gives you a little bit of the taste of some of those types of occupations and, some concrete examples as to how some companies are using these platforms. So, for example, we have Samsung, GE, and Procter & Gamble who are focusing on the virtual on-demand services platforms and hiring high to skill medium workers. And here you really see the traditional IT computer occupation. So those software and web developers, search marketing strategists is another one, the graphic designers. Those are being heavily used by these companies. One outlier is Procter & Gamble, which is also using platforms for business operations that may be more core to their day-to-day business. So, for example, management consultants and market research analysts and also regulatory compliance specialists. So it really shows that there's a breadth of occupations that are available on these platforms. And then on the lower part of this grid, you see other companies that are using physical on-demand platforms for that lower skill, blue-collar type occupation. So Coca-Cola using these platforms to hire extra delivery drivers. AMN Healthcare, which is itself a staffing agency in the healthcare industry, is also using them, trying to hire more production-type workers to pack and ship and clean medical equipment in their warehouses. And then Marriott, Five Guys, and Muncherie, which is like a Blue Apron type food service, they're using these platforms in order to fill gaps in their staffing situations. So hiring maids and housekeepers, cashiers and dishwashers and other food prep workers, and then order fillers. And this is common in the retail industry where these types of jobs may be available. And I'll actually just backtrack one slide very quickly. So, talking about what is common, let me go one forward here. What is common amongst all of these Well, we'll just...
yeah.
I got it now.
I don't know if we're both doing it at the same time, maybe. So what is common amongst all of these occupations? And most of them don't require any type of institutional knowledge. So you can hire workers and not need to give them a lot of background information as to your institution. Most of them are performing non-core activities. We did see that outlier with Procter & Gamble. Most of them offer relatively low pay, even in the space for the white-collar, more knowledge workers, because those occupations are on an online platform where there's a global labor market. Those workers are competing against other workers in other parts of the world that are commanding a lower wage rate. So you're going to bring those labor costs down quite a bit. Occupations are also tied to seasonal or varying demand, especially during this time of year when we have the holiday season, and companies are looking for extra workers. Many of these occupations call for recent or emerging skills or unique, hard-to-find skill sets. And the best example here is, 3 or 4 years ago when companies were trying to all develop an app, a mobile app, for workers or for customers. You could go to this type of platform and find this niche skill set. I mean, now that's much more common, but 5 or 6 years ago, that wasn't the case. Occupations on these platforms also involve specific, well-defined tasks where output is easily measured and monitored, and they are in positions where the damage from a bad hire is low. So in many cases, you can hire these workers into these positions where they can hit the ground running, and there's really very little probability that they're not going to be able to quickly contribute to the organization.
So Elizabeth, you mentioned that some of the main opportunities that our companies can access through using these global, these non-traditional these labor market platforms is a global talent pool, reduced costs. What are some of the other opportunities, and what are some of the challenges that have limited the ability of companies to start using these platforms?
Right. Well, on the challenges side, it's really what Amy was talking about before, that most of these platforms aren't large enough to be able to offer enterprise level solutions that are going to work with those HR and procurement systems. So the examples that we just talked about with those companies, they're using the largest platforms in this space where they are actually now starting to offer some options for large companies. But for the most part, that's not very common so far. Also, adopting a platform in your company is more akin to implementing a new technology where you really have to, it requires employee buy-in, new skills and training, changes in employee roles, and even having a culture shift around that recruitment strategy. For a company, it's not as easy as just downloading an app on your phone and hiring somebody right away. There's more of an organizational component around that, and with that there could be organizational resistance. So that's another main challenge. And on the opportunity side, like you said, targeting specific roles and occupations, you could potentially find better matches and more quickly. A lot of these platforms have these matching algorithms. They also provide worker ratings and reviews and profiles and access to past portfolios of work, so you have a lot more information as to the individual candidates. The global talent pool, like you said, there's increased flexibility in workforce planning, reduction in costs, like I mentioned previously with lower wage rates. Also, compared to staffing through a traditional temp help agency or an outsourcing company that may have higher overhead costs, some of these platforms have lower fees because they're not dealing with those overhead costs of having a physical location to deal with. And then there's other ancillary services such as software for monitoring employees that much of these platforms come with, because they are essentially helping businesses monitor employees that you don't have face-to-face interaction. So that's very important. And then the division of jobs into tasks. Basically, having these platforms enables companies to parcel out even a greater amount of activity into different roles. So it gives more opportunities to use these platforms going forward.
Elizabeth, you talk about many, many ways of using these platforms in order to develop new ways of fulfilling specific tasks within an organization. But at the same time, you highlight, which I think is really, really important, this idea of organizational resistance. And indeed, Amy, this ends up being a theme that you found when you surveyed our members to learn how they're thinking about using non-traditional workers. Tell the audience about the survey, and then why are organizations motivated to use non-traditional work arrangements?
That's great. Thank you, Brian. And yes, one of the things we did for this research project was obviously to analyze bigger picture data sets, like from the BLS data set. But we also said, let's go to our members and let's hear from them and what they think about non-traditional workers and how are they viewing it. And for the research team and myself, we saw some conflicting information, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as I present the next couple of slides. But we first started asking very basic questions to our members, like yourselves. Why is your organization using non-traditional workers? And for the most part, you can see it's extra workers, short-term projects, seasonal needs. They need flexibility in different ways to use their workforce, or they have skills that they don't have in their current workforce. One thing to note is that you can see reduced labor costs is actually at the bottom of the list there. Saving money, of course, is valuable to many organizations, but it's generally not the primary driver of why companies are using non-traditional workers. We also asked them, because we realized that many businesses that we interact with have seasonal and non-seasonal business demands. So we said, well, how are you using them, and how much or how often, how many of them, in terms of a percentage of your workforce, are you using non-traditional workers? And for the most part, you can see sort of lower half on this chart is for normal business conditions, we might range from 5% or less or 6 to 10%. But if you actually look at the top half of this chart, from the 11% to 51% or more, this picture changes dramatically when you talk about seasonal business conditions. And right now we're in the peak of the holiday season. This is one of those examples of seasonal business conditions where many companies we work with, the last 3 months of the year, they may triple the number of headcount in terms of actual workers as part of their workforce. And this is where we go to a couple of these small percentages. While small, 3% in normal business conditions, 5% in seasonal business conditions. It's not a huge amount of companies doing this, but they're estimating 51% or more non-traditional workers at that time. Many of the companies we work with in our membership are huge companies. So 50% or more could be from 60,000 to 120,000. And indeed, one of the companies we work with, I think something like 70,000 extra headcount for a couple of months of the year. Just thinking about that from a HR, administration, processing perspective is overwhelming. It's difficult to manage, and yet that's the way these businesses have chosen to meet their business demands.
Amy, before you continue, I think it's important to note it's been the case for a long time that companies have needed to fill many seasonal positions with non-traditional workers. But what we've also found is that the rate at which firms are using non-traditional workers hasn't necessarily increased in recent years. You had the chance to speak with members as part of this research project. Did you find that there were members who are starting to use non-traditional workers at higher rates in order to fill some of those seasonal positions?
So the seasonal positions versus business, normal business, I think they have, I don't have numbers to show that they've really increased overall across many different organizations. I think over the decades, companies have learned to use them more efficiently or better, if you will. So historically, we may not have had online shopping, right? Gad mentioned that as an example of increasing the number of blue-collar workers we need because of the innovation of online shopping. Well, seasonally, we didn't have that in the past. And now, everybody is online shopping for the seasonal holiday needs. And that, I think, pushes over time the need for this type of seasonal demand. But that's one industry or a couple of companies in one industry, depending on where they are going. So I don't know that we can say it's significantly growing, but I think companies that I've talked to have started to use non-traditional workers in greater extent. Let me give you an example. I was just talking to a large global pharmaceutical company. They are on track to make an arrangement, a deal or a contract with a very, very large partner to basically outsource almost half of their workforce in a critical pharmaceutical operational role. So they are the example of where they could be, 100,000 employees. Half of it, they're looking to partner with this other company to essentially outsource that half. And it doesn't mean that they don't want to pay attention to that group or that they care less about that group. In fact, they care significantly about that group. But somehow they have made an understanding and a partner that had more capabilities and technologies, actually. That's where they're actually going. It wasn't just a cost play. That partner had technology and other skills that they wanted in their workforce. And as a result, they're making these sorts of arrangements. Now, that's one example, one company. But I think increasingly we're starting to see different examples selectively, right? Carefully, very nuanced, very targeted, of where companies are figuring out how to use their workforce. And like your slide earlier that Gad was talking about from the global perspective, a couple of the companies that we spoke with on this research project were based out of Europe. And in Europe, as you noted on that slide, is very different than the US in terms of their ability and desire to work with non-traditional workers. And again, there we see, I think, greater use, right? And companies that are more inclined, if you will, to have non-traditional workers in their workforce and implement different approaches and practices to support those groups. So it's just fascinating in my mind. But let me just move on really quickly. Companies that are targeting specific roles and functions. So we've already hinted at this already. You know, computer workers in normal business conditions, very common. We see that a lot. And then we see also some growth in the, well, not growth, I should say, larger percentage or larger use of non-traditional workers in the seasonal business changes, things like customer service or art and design communication workers. So we see a number of different things, but it's clear that companies do target specific roles and specific functions for non-traditional work. One of the companies we spoke with, for example, they wanted to do a new company logo. Well, they don't have a they weren't big enough to have a marketing department with those types of capabilities, and designing a logo is a short-term need. You know, once you design it, you have it. So they basically went to an outsource or a contingent worker for that particular skill. So that's an example of that. But it is very, and more specialized. Many, again, people think it could be lower skill workers. We do have a number of examples of, you know, financial workers, lawyers is a very interesting area that we see a lot of talk about in terms of short-term need, specialized law. We don't need a full-time person, and we can do that as a contingent worker. We also see this in healthcare pharmaceuticals. I've already hinted at this organization that I was just talking to. Very highly skilled, specialized knowledge around, let's say, the process of getting a drug approved through the FDA process, and bringing those people in for that specialized skill for a particular term or project in their organization.
So you've highlighted already some of the occupations that companies are using, and really the ability to provide of non-traditional work arrangements to provide greater flexibility. But what are some of the factors that companies are concerned about when they start thinking about using non-traditional work arrangements?
So there's quite a bit of concern for sure. Lots of challenge around that. There are different labor laws in the US as they are in Europe, and by the way, every country is different. So if you are working in this space, you kind of have to understand the different laws in every country that you're operating in, and that creates complexity. What we find, though, are organizations, when we asked the members in this survey, is what is your greatest concern? It's actually finding the right workers, finding the right skills, right? Sharing and any sort of distribution of their intellectual knowledge, of course, is always a concern. Supervising and managing these non-traditional workers. Do you have the managers that understand how to manage non-traditional workers? Is it different than managing a regular employee? And how are they understanding that as part of their team and how businesses get done? Legal and government regulations are obviously part of that, and also engaging and motivating them. So lots of different challenges that organizations understand. Workers are still workers. You still need to understand what motivates them, what engages them, and how do you retain them, especially with all the labor market shortages that we've just heard about from Brian and Gad and Elizabeth. What do organizations need to understand about these types of workers? Are they different from regular employees, if you will, and how should they approach them differently, as well as tossing on top of that all the regulatory government policies, laws of what you cannot do. It becomes quite a chaotic, overwhelming kind of situation to try to comprehend. And we also ask CHROs, by the way. You can see this is from our C-Suite challenge of last year. We asked CHROs whether they are anticipating growth in their non-traditional workforce. And by looking at these numbers, they are overwhelmingly saying yes, they will be hiring more non-traditional workers in their future. They completely, I mean, something like, look at those numbers, 77%, they do anticipate their workforce will be different tomorrow or in the future than it is compared to today. And lots of challenges, right? How many percentages that they will be continuing to work with for outsourced service providers. They absolutely expect that to increase. I mean, these numbers are actually fairly dramatic in terms of how the CHRO perceives their company and organization's use of non-traditional workers, especially as it compares to some of the macro data that we've just been analyzing on this webcast. Right? So it's very different views of, is it a hype? Is it a trend? How are they thinking about it? How are they different? There's no question we see pockets and examples of companies doing very different work than what they have done before. Some of it was like the pharmaceutical I just mentioned. In Europe, I think there are a lot more practices being implemented around this because, again, they have a greater percentage of non-traditional workers. So a lot of it just begs the question. So I think we're in this midst of a transitional era. We spent a lot of time, actually, at the conference board talking about the future of work, and our C-suite challenge and other reports focus on this future of work. And I think this is an example of a transitional issue that represents the evolving, changing future of work. And it will continue to evolve. Things will continue to change. Companies are trying to figure out and are figuring out ways around, not around, but in support of their regulations and the policies and the laws, how else can they still work with different populations of the workforce. And really quickly, just in the interest of time, I'll finish up these slides. CHRO also realized that their biggest challenge with non-traditional workers is engaging and retaining them, similar to regular employees. So the workforce that they have from a CHRO perspective is the same, regardless of employment status. They have to find them, they have to engage them, they have to retain them. It's a very difficult thing to do, and we see different companies, again, trying and attempting to figure this out. How do we find them? How do we retain them? And you've already heard a couple of suggestions from Gad around this for the future. And then finally, companies are experimenting with different approaches to engaging and retaining their workforce. So we are inviting non-traditional workers to training programs. We may invite them into employee engagement initiatives. Another large healthcare organization I was just talking to is they are now incorporating non-traditional workers in their employee resource groups, their ERGs, right, in the organization, which are classically employee benefits and group community building, but they're now incorporating non-traditional workers into that as well. So different examples of activities, practices, and things, company benefits, perks, or just approaches of them trying to figure out how to engage and retain their employees.
So in the final minute,
yes,
a question to each of you,
yes,
and only 15 seconds for answers. In the title of this report, the word hype is present. There are obviously many barriers to the use of non-traditional work, but also many opportunities. Starting with Elizabeth, will that word hype be in the title of a conference board report on non-traditional work in 2023?
From what my research in terms of the companies, they're really starting to see that this is an opportunity that they can leverage. So, and from what I'm seeing with the platforms, are also starting to see that they have to make changes in order to cater to this new enterprise level demand. So I think that by 2023, it's going to be less hype and a little bit more working together with these larger platforms, and businesses are going to be able to engage with them much more easily.
So I think in the U.S., despite all the data that we've been debating, in the U.S., I think it will still be a hint more of the hype. I don't see dramatic shifts occurring, despite all the company practices changing and evolving in different ways. I don't see it growing at a broad scale. So it will still be a little bit more of a hype in the short term, unless dramatic things happen in our policy and our government laws and all of that kind of thing.
So Gad, Amy thinks policy is going to be a reason why non-traditional work may still be hype in 5 years. What is your perspective on the issue?
Well, I think hype is partly the gap between the reality and what some people are saying about that. So I think there will be a convergence a little. So I think it will be probably a little larger than it is now, and people will not, at the same time, there will be very few people who will say that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I mean, there were a lot of people who I think significantly exaggerated, like even one company that came out with a report that said that other than the C-suite, everyone else would be a contingent worker. And so I think we won't hear that 5 years from now, because it will clearly not be the case. So I think the gap between reality and the discussion is going to shrink significantly.
Thank you, Gad, and thank you, Amy and Elizabeth, for those thoughts. Certainly an uncertain environment, but one that presents many opportunities and challenges for our members going forward. A few housekeeping items just before we go. You can use the code KN1 for a $500 discount on a series of HR-related conferences, some of which you may very well see Gad or Amy present at. And so there are great opportunities to talk more about non-traditional workers. And then in addition, a few publications and webcasts to share. At our report here, Contrary to the Hype, the Global Labor Market Outlook, in which Gad goes through some of the key trends, not just in US, but global labor market shortages. Tomorrow, please join us for the final edition of Economics Watch with the 2019 Outlook, and also an examination of trends towards more local sourcing in terms of trade. And then finally, a conference upcoming on talent management strategies. So for Brian Shaitkin in New York, I wish all of you a happy holiday, and thank you again for joining us on this webcast.